Would like to go first?
Zana would love to go.
Zana has been volunteered.
The maturity happens, you see, over summer.
I like to observe and listen more than talk.
I'm starting to get a bit nervous on this side of the table.
But I still had in my mind to become a writer, much like you.
Ooh.
And I think it's just like a quote that summarizes this thinking that they have.
So I was kind of really struck by the confidence of that statement.
This is the Person of Interest podcast, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell.
Well, welcome back to the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga after a fairly lengthy hiatus for reasons which probably no one has missed around the world. We're back to a fully vaccinated podcast. I'm delighted to have two guests to fill up the space that we've had, two guests rather than one. We've got Kata Fredheim, who's Executive Vice President at SSE Riga, an assistant professor and by trade an anthropologist. Am I correct? Correct. And also sitting next to her we have Zane Varpina, who is an associate professor at SSE Riga, a faculty advisor and by trade a demographer.
That's right, yes.
So the obvious question that we're going to get towards is how do we mix anthropology and demographics? But we'll get onto that in a little while. First, as is my usual way, I'd like you to introduce yourselves to the listeners. But particularly, how did you end up doing what you're doing today? Maybe who would like to go first?
Zana would love to go.
Zana has been volunteered. So how did you end up in this position?
In demography or in...
Yeah, well, in demography, in academia, and in SSE.
Yeah, well, I mean, all my life, actually, I've been working in education sector. Like since the very, very first job I had in research and education. So that's, I actually started off as a analytical economics program, and so first training is in economics, and then somehow I was working in University of Latvia for some time, and that somehow got me into the education research and doing education and demography as the field of research for my PhD. And and then it continued into research in BICEPS research centers that we have here in SSE Riga premises and very closely connected with SSE. And then I started SSE, so that's been sort of very smooth career from one into the other, very much connected with each other.
But going back a little bit before that, because a lot of the research that you've been carrying out and that we're going to discuss is involving sort of 16, 17-year-olds. But going back to your own school days, what was the thing that pushed you towards economics or demographics? Was it a case of always feeling you had a sort of mathematical talent or something, or was it an inspirational teacher, as it often is?
Oh, not really. I had different ideas. I was a very good pupil. I had like good grades in all and everything. I could actually have chosen any directions that I wanted, but somehow economics was very popular at that time, and also that's probably the reason how I was sort of got into that. That was in end of 90s, when all the sort of other careers didn't look so promising, I guess. My other direction would have been medicine, but I didn't pursue that, probably because of the situation at that time. And ever since I got really into the hard line, more the academic line of analytical line of economics.
Do you ever regret not choosing medicine?
No, not anymore. No.
But it is quite interesting that in Latvian context there was a time when, well, some people would argue that there still is, when economics was seen as quite a sort of sexy subject, as it were. It was kind of the really in thing to do.
It certainly was at that time. It was one of the highest competition for the study places, which, well, being a little competitive, if you can get in there, that's really something.
Interesting.
Yeah.
High competition. And Kata, how about you? What's your sort of academic story?
My academic story. Okay. So I finished high school. And like many of the people we will be talking about, I went abroad. So I left home when I was 18, and I started at a liberal arts university, which was great because I got...
Where was this?
In the Netherlands.
Yeah.
So I got to study a bit of economics, a lot of international relations, a bit of statistics. But I still had in my mind to become a writer, much like you.
Ooh.
Yes, then I chose the easy way
A fellow
out.
fantasist.
But I wasn't as adamant about it, probably as you are. So I finished that, and then I've done a master's, and then the economic crisis came.
Mm.
And so I was thinking about what is it that I really want to do, and what is the impact of all of this. And I always got quite lucky, because then I realized that what really I'm interested in is people, and how do people think, and what do they do, and how do they relate to what's going on. And then I got a scholarship to New Zealand, and I lived and did my PhD research in New Zealand, studying Pacific Islanders, who are a very liminal group there. Mm-hmm. And then I was a bit less lucky. We had a lot of earthquakes happening, if you remember that time when the South Island was basically destroyed.
Yeah.
And then I got a scholarship to Oxford, and then I got to work with some brilliant anthropologists on my research. And then...
That's interesting in that almost sounds like, I mean, anthropology these days, it seems to me, is an incredibly wide and diverse field. But, you know, going down and studying South Sea Islanders sounds like the sort of classic notion of anthropology that I probably shouldn't be thinking of, but it seems like it's, you know, the Fraser Golden Bough type thing to do, right?
Yeah, but it wasn't, because what I looked at is actually second and third generation migrants to New Zealand. So I didn't go to the islands. I was studying these communities whose parents or grandparents moved to New Zealand, and how do they negotiate their identities? How do they think of themselves? Where do they stand in education, in economics, in arts? How do they talk about their languages, English or whatever island languages they speak? So it's actually proper non-classical anthropology in that sense.
But it also strikes me that you must have a certain amount of confidence to be able to go to completely different cultures and have the confidence to approach them, to open up to you, but also to think that you have the ability to have insight, as it were, that you can come in and produce some sort of research which is valid based on it. I mean, do you see what I mean? There must be a very specific kind of mindset that thinks you can, or believes you have the confidence to do that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comment, because when I started, I didn't have that. I was 22 and just very naive. I was just curious about people and communities and seeing their lives, and also learning about their perspectives. What I was then trained to do is to sort of stay away from that and not apply judgment, just curiosity, and really try to understand how people think. So I'm not an expert on anyone. I just have this sort of lens to peek into people's life and learn more about it and view things from their perspectives and write about it. But I wouldn't, I'm not an expert on any culture because of that.
I suppose it requires you to have this sort of receptivity to kind of everything, yeah?
Yeah, I like to observe and listen more than talk.
I'm starting to get a bit nervous on this side of the table. But so if we talk about listening to people, the research that you've been collaborating on for the last 3 years, I think you were telling me, it involved 12th graders in Latvia, so 16, 17-year-olds, and their opinions, their desires with regard to migration, so living abroad, studying abroad, how likely it is, what the motivations are. This is a very bad summary by me, but it does involve listening to this group of people who were sometimes brushed aside as just teenagers, or they don't know what they want yet, or a sort of intermediary group between children and adults. and listening to what they think. So could you just give us a little bit of a summary about what the research is, maybe what your initial aim was, and how perhaps the results have modified that over the 3-year study?
Okay, so it's a 3-year study. It's a bigger study, and actually talking at to high school students is a small part of it. So it's a study set up to learn about return migration to the Baltic, so Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. And a very interesting part of so we talk to return migrants, we talk to entrepreneurs and businesses. But a very interesting part of it is learning about high school students, because we want to know what they are thinking now and what we can learn not just about the now, but also the future. What are the indications what will happen in 5 or 10 years? And so the questions we ask them are about their life, what they did before, their school, what do they want to do in the future, do they want to study or work, what, do they want to migrate, how are they doing, which is a very important part of it now because of COVID.
Yeah, I think also one of the other motivations was that we really observed this, that there's not too much of information about what happens to the adolescents or young people after they exit the door of the secondary school. So we have sort of good information about like how they are going on, how they are in school, but then so how many of them leave, how many of them go to study, how many and how much time it takes and everything. So from that point of view, it's just interesting, and it's a very transformational period in one's life, because that's really the first independent step. Well, give or take, right? But
you have choice of some sort.
When you are, you're forced to make your choices. First, independent moves, also physical moves away from home. First, career choices. So how and then our idea was like to explore. Okay, so what determines, what are their aspirations, what are their thinking? And in migration context also to think, okay, so what do they think in terms of migration? Do they want to live abroad? Do they want to stay? Why they do that? And then yet another aspect is also, of course, because we are an SSE Riga is a higher education institution, and we are very much interested in who these people are that come into our school, and how can we make our education better to fit their dreams, aspirations, purpose, and everything.
And it's a bit of a prosaic nuts and bolts question, but whenever I see research like this, I'm interested in finding out how physically do you collect the data? How do you do the interviews? Is it face-to-face interviews? How do you get people's names and addresses? How do you get them to agree to participate, and then, I guess, to continue to participate over a course of several years? Because I think that must be quite an effort in itself.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you get someone involved?
So just purely from methods point of view, we do survey of secondary school pupils right before they graduate, because our idea is just like we really want to talk to them before they leave. So that's the last moment.
This is distributed via the schools?
And so this is distributed by schools. Yeah. In the first year of our study, we actually went to schools and distributed the survey there. Last year, with COVID, we had to sort of change it all very rapidly to actually collect data, and we did it online. And it actually worked quite well, so we had pretty high respondents. Schools are very cooperative to distribute and help us with that. And so that's one way of primary information that we have. And the second is we conduct a lot of qualitative interviews.
But I think if I may, one other thing that I think is really great about the surveys is that we don't just leave them. After they graduate, we follow up with them.
Yeah.
So we do a follow-up survey and we find out, okay, so where are they 6 months on? And that is a really interesting insight into what their plans were and what are they doing now.
Because listeners might like to know that there is a brief sort of 15-20 minute summary of some of the research which is available online, which we'll link to in the podcast description. And in that, I was struck by, it seemed to me that you'd kind of developed a sort of relationship with some of these people. And there was someone you'd given the name Patricia, who clearly at the beginning was quite withdrawn, but was able to give more information as the talks progressed. I mean, that must be kind of a confidence data set and a lack of confidence data set that you need hopefully work towards the confident one, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the magic of interviews, because then afterwards we do qualitative interviews with them where we sit down for an hour or two. Not all of us. We have a brilliant person helping us with that, and just let them talk. And I think a lot of the quotes, like Patricia's, will come from that, when they just have an hour to talk about what they are thinking about, and what their hopes and dreams are, and where they want to go, and reflect on their choices. And I think a lot of the depth, perhaps, comes from that.
That comes from interviews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to talk to them.
And do you feel that maybe the second, third year they have been kind of almost preparing their answers, in that they've noted things during the course of the year to which they can update you, as it were, rather than just starting from scratch again? Because presumably they're thinking in a quite active way about the choices they're making in a way that maybe they hadn't if you hadn't intervened, as it were, and asked their opinion.
So see, this is something I would love to do in the future, but the interviews we only do once.
Right.
But what I can tell you is that for the first year we did some pilots, which was, because the project started in August, we interviewed people in October, where they obviously made their choices already. And talking to people who have been out of high school and at university mostly for a month or two, it's just so interesting to compare just how much older they seem, how much more mature, and how their thinking changed, even though they were not the same people. So this is something I would love to do for a future project, Zane.
Yeah, right. So it's the maturity happens, you see, over summer.
Yeah.
Basically. So.
Zana, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background on the fact that Latvia in many ways is in demographic terms is quite unusual, in that from just before EU accession up until maybe the economic crisis and beyond, there's huge migration outwards, and since then kind of concerted effort to get people to re-emigrate back here as well. But the figures, I think it's something like 13%, wasn't it, between 2004 and 2010 or something, emigrated in terms of the actual number of the population, which to most countries would seem to be pretty mind-boggling. So there's a sort of predisposition or a familiarity maybe in families in Latvia with the idea of migration, which isn't in a lot of other countries. So how does that play into the situation that these 16, 17-year-olds find themselves in?
Yeah, well, I think it's also one of the reasons that has triggered the study, actually, to see what they plan in terms of migration, if they want to go abroad or if they want to stay, and what are the reasons for that. Obviously, well, what we see from our survey data, about 15% of the people we survey, they have migration experience, meaning that they have been abroad for at least lived abroad for at least 3 months.
So that's already they have this experience.
And that's pretty much across all 3 years that we've seen. So they do have this. Many of them have parents living abroad, live abroad, who have lived abroad. So that of course also plays a role in how they choose what to do. But I think if we sort of go forward into the reasons why people want to live abroad, because what we do actually in the study, we look at 2 things in terms of their further choices. We look at what they will do immediately after the school. Do they want to study or work or do something else, and where they want to do it, and also then what do they plan sometime in the future. And the way we address and ask the question is like, do you want to live abroad for some time in your life? Realizing that at the age of 17 or 18, they cannot say, yes, I will live abroad for 1 year and a half and then come back. And that's not possible. And none of us actually can do it at the time when migration flows are becoming really fluid. This is a terminology that the migration researchers use. So the people come and go, they stay, they migrate back. So at this time, we really wanted to find out, okay, so what do they think? And the result is that there are 60% of youngsters who say that they either definitely or probably want to live abroad for some time of their life. Yeah. And then there are another 30% who are sort of unsure. And it's just a minority, just about those 10% who say, no, definitely not or never. So to us, that was, I think, at least for me, the most surprising fact, that how many want to live abroad. And then regarding the reasons, how we came to that, is the fact that they, what we ever expected, that they would say, oh yeah, there are those traditional push and pull factors. It's so low salaries and things here, and there's such a much better life abroad and more money and better conditions and everything. This is just not there. People want to have experiences. So they want to see the world, the culture, the experience different, something different. So it's...
and I guess particularly when you're that age, I mean, that must be a very powerful driver as well, probably more so than the economic factors if you're not sort of fully economically active yet.
And it's by all means almost the only driver, you see. Very, very interesting, I think, to that we found.
And that also runs completely counter to, let's say, populist interpretations of why migration happens, right? And that it's always about wanting more money or wanting an easier life, all that kind of stuff. What your research is suggesting is that it's more about people seeking values and seeking to expand their horizons, really, not just in financially, but in fact not even financially, but in a sort of self-development sense.
Yeah, the students talk about adventure, about getting to know different cultures, about traveling, about networking. They also talk about linking back to families and people who migrated, people they know abroad. So whether they returned or not, they're a huge source of inspiration and knowledge. So almost all the people who are thinking about going abroad who were interviewed, they talk about relatives, friends, acquaintances, and their experiences and what they already learned from that.
And is there variation between the Baltic states? I know the sort of the commonly accepted idea is that Estonians would migrate slightly less than, say, Latvians and Lithuanians. Was there anything in the interviews that confirmed or denied that?
So these interviews these are the only interviews we only did in Latvia.
Okay.
But what you see in Estonia, for instance, is there's a lot more return migrants. So especially in the last 3 years, you can really see the numbers ticking up because people are returning in larger proportions. Not so much in Lithuania. Another very interesting piece of research it would be, because there's no information about it. This was the pilot part of our study. This was what we were least confident about, talking to high school students in a way. We didn't know how it's going to work.
But if 60% of the ones in Latvia are basically thinking at some point they're going to be spending part of their lives in another country, it's like the default setting is that we will migrate at some point, and for whatever the length of period is. I mean, that must be pretty extraordinary compared to, let's say, the majority of other countries or larger countries. Is it just the fact that Latvia being a relatively small country, people want to get out and see the big wide world, or is it, I mean, has it been caused by the the familiarity from family links and so on, and maybe it seems less intimidating, because I imagine that in maybe, I don't know, the US or France or somewhere, the idea of someone moving abroad to another country can be quite intimidating, whereas here it doesn't seem to have that sort of fear factor.
I think the networks and the communities abroad definitely give some sort of a confidence, it seems, from the interviews. But I also think it's about the size of the country from the interviews. Absolutely. In a different way. They feel it's small and they need to learn more. And there's more opportunities for specialization, for just expanding their horizons.
Yeah, many of them say there's more opportunities, and I want to give one citation from one of the interviews. So, where the respondent, it's a she. She says that it's frightening to think that I will spend my whole life in one country when the world is so big and full of opportunities. And I think it's just like a quote that summarizes this thinking that they have. So yeah, Latvia is small, and for us it's just there's not too much inside the country where we can migrate and obtain different experiences, whereas compared to like France or
well, there is a real authenticity that comes out in some of the quotes you use. I was struck by another one where it was the rare instance of I think it was a woman as well, a young woman who said, no, I don't want to go abroad because I'm very close to my church and I want to stay in my parish and I feel like I belong there. And that also, I was kind of really struck by the confidence of that statement, in that I know my place, and I mean, it's entirely possible that at some point later in life she might think differently, but to be so confident so young, I thought was quite striking as well.
Yeah, that was something that I find really interesting. She's actually from Latgale.
Okay.
So what you have is a lot of 50% of students aged 18 to 24 will live in Riga. But she and many people actually from Daugavpils and that region are quite happy to stay. They contemplate moving to Riga, they contemplate moving abroad, but then they have this sort of happiness about living where they are. Of course, there's the opposite side as well, because of nature, because of the community, because of the parish, etc.
And yet that's also the region with the biggest traditional push-pull factors. I mean, it's the sort of economically the most depressed, and where you would expect there to be people, fighting to get out. But because of this sense of identity, I guess, you feel that you are in the right place. The research itself, people will be able to check it online and go into it. It's absolutely fascinating. But what is the application of it? I mean, there have been repeated official drives to promote re-emigration, for example, which seem to have had a certain amount of success, but not sort of striking success. Is this the sort of tool that can be used to help that process become more efficient, or how do you see it being applied?
So I see, actually, because we interview such different groups, and we talk to entrepreneurs and managers. From their perspective, it's really interesting to find out what they want from a returnee and how they appreciate them in the job market, for instance. We interview return migrants, and it's really interesting to see what their experiences were returning. Did they integrate? Did they find it easy? Was it really difficult for them? And for students, perhaps one of the more interesting groups is that it just actually shows how hard this decision is. And maybe it is useful, definitely for us as a university, but also for educators to be better prepared to give the information or the support they need to make these decisions. And also for policymakers to look ahead and see what the intentions are. Because intentions are very powerful in predicting the future.
Well, intentions are what determines, at least partly determines what they actually do. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the indicator of where they want to go, but actually what determines their choice. But from at least higher education perspective and us as a school, I think it's still very interesting to draw on the conclusion that the young people, they want to have this global international experience. And what I think is really that some of the times they really don't want to sort of go abroad for a whole degree and stay there. So actually for a school or a higher education institution, we could tailor and adapt the program in such a way that there are more exchange programs, and the young people can satisfy their need and will for this internationalization by going like on a half year or 1 year of exchange, and keeping much higher, better ties with home country. So if we sort of design the programs and policies in such a way that would actually keep the people more connected. We also, of course, know that, well, the people from where people graduate from higher education, it's very, very, very likely they will enter the labor market in that country. So they start before graduation, after, so at the time. So if people are actually connected to a local university, at the same time experiencing their international drive, let's say, then that could actually be pretty beneficial for all labor markets as well. So, but still at the same time, we have to be ready that people will migrate back and forth. So it's the times when people make decision to migrate and stay there for their life. Those times are more or less gone. It's the flow, the fluid migration that we have seen in Europe. That's migration research, as I said in the beginning. That's what it shows, and especially for young people. So they will come and go, and they will stay if they're satisfied, but then they could go. And then, well, I think also for regard back of this COVID time now, in some way now this sort of hybrid work and online work has been actually pretty beneficial, maybe from some points of view for our population, because people can work. They can work in Silicon Valley, and I know some that do, while sitting in their house home in Kuldīga.
Yeah.
Which is something we have never seen before, right?
But I did want to ask you. I mean, we're about 18 months into the COVID pandemic, and obviously that has brought severe restrictions at certain times on travel, ability to migrate. How has that fed into your data? I guess you've kind of have some of it covered, but we're certainly not at the end of this stage. So is there a danger that it kind of skews your data, as it were, as it comes towards an end? Because it would be very interesting to see what happens after, as COVID winds down, to see if there's a return to what was the situation before, or whether COVID has indeed changed the way that we all go about these things and we all go about migration in future. And it might mean that people go abroad for longer periods because of fluctuating disease levels or something, or it might mean they go for shorter periods and constantly updating a certificate or something. So how do you see it panning out, and will this be shown in your sort of future studies?
So for students, actually I think we are quite lucky in that we had data from before COVID, and now we have the chance to do 2 rounds of data collection during the pandemic. So we see a little bit what was before and what was after. And of course there are huge differences in how students are taught, in the confidence of their knowledge and what they are taught, their preparedness for real life. There's a bit of a fear of how we will adjust to university life, but the intentions to migrate haven't really changed that much. So last year we expected, for instance, that a lot of people will want to stay and not go abroad, and that happened to a certain degree because of the uncertainty, but it wasn't like a very big impact. And by now what we are seeing is that students are quite happy to study online. It's a thing they do. So they can study online and be located physically in Latvia, but studying in the Netherlands, and that's okay with them, the same way they can be in Kuldīga and studying in Riga. So there seems to be, from the early data, a shift of mindset, which I think is very interesting. We find that to some degree with managers as well, but we are still processing that data, so I'm less confident talking about that.
Yeah, but talking about future, of course, it remains to be seen what will continue and what will change again. So in that way you're right, that what we have now we cannot extrapolate to next 5 or 10 years. We really have to see sort of follow up on what's happening after, hopefully when this is over, right, or whichever shape and form the world will be at that time. So in that way we would need to continue the research. So it shouldn't be just finished, packed,
it would be
published and done.
Shame to cut it off in the middle of the story, as it were.
No, because the story, as you exactly say, is happening, and we don't know how it will resolve.
Well, and also with what you were saying about the values, the experience, the broadening of the mind being the big attraction. Well, it's all very well to sit in Kuldiga typing away on the keyboard and look at pictures of Rome or whatever, or learn about Rome. It's not the same as being in Rome, is it? And if that, I would suspect, in my completely unscientific way, that young people really, really want to get out there and do want to live physically in other places rather than just sort of experience them on cyberspace. But maybe I'm just an old man.
No, I think we've been finding that, but it's just the other place sometimes now means not in your living room as well. So I think that the way people think about space has changed. It's no longer just being abroad. Sometimes it's just actually outside of this very small comfort zone or non-comfort zone we've been locked into. That's one very interesting finding. I wonder how fast or how slow it's going to take until we again, and I know this is anthropological speak, we embrace how broad and big the space can be, but sometimes now more and more research finds that space becomes, it shrunk so much and time became invisible that people take time to readjust to that. So I think it's very interesting to even just think about what we could do to learn about this in the future.
Well, we've unfortunately just about run out of time, but I'd like to finish with one question which will require you to use your imagination a little bit and rewind to 17-year-old you. And if you were asked, are you going to migrate, where are you going to live, for how long, what do you think you would have answered? And would it have borne any resemblance to your real life story? Zane?
Yeah, right. That's an interesting question to think about. Well, that's 1996, 97 when I graduated from school, and that was a very, very different time. We at that time we didn't have the opportunities here in Latvia. We wouldn't even think in that breath that it's actually possible to go for a little bit and come back. Yeah, exchange programs and some foreign study opportunities appeared a bit later when I was but at that time I didn't have a file of sort of, I will go abroad. I would have said, probably not.
And so probably the opportunities that would have been made available to you turned out to be way, way wider than what you could have imagined then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Kata, how about you?
I was definitely not going to migrate. But then that was 2004 when we joined the EU. And suddenly there were all these opportunities. And I'm from a small town. Going to the big city, the capital, was the plan, and study at a good university. And then I got offers from abroad, and I just chanced it because of the adventure element. I didn't know what I'm getting into. But no, I was not going to migrate, and actually I never returned, so it's kind of not a very happy story in that sense for the country.
Well, no, but I think it is a happy story in that I just chanced it. I think that's exactly what 17-year-olds should be thinking, right? Thank you very much for speaking to me. I recommend that people read view the online lecture and follow-up material which we'll make available. And perhaps at some point in the future you could come back and update us, because I think this is definitely not the end of the research that you're doing.
Would love to. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the conversation, and definitely we'll come back with more results. And that will be in a year.
In a year.
Well, we have something confident to tell, yes.
Excellent. See you in a year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSE Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSE Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.